But nonetheless, this statistic is posited as if 1 in 4 married men is assaulting and beating his wife. Also, many feminists who argue that the vast majority of domestic violence is carried out by men will only actually conduct their research on women. They won't even ask men whether they've been the victim of domestic violence. However, research does show that domestic violence can be perpetrated equally between the sexes. And also research comparing abuse between both gay, lesbian and heterosexual couples shows that actually men are not that much more likely, if at all, to be violent towards their spouses than women are. I'm going to conclude now just by looking at 3 very general examples of continued state encroachment on family life. Most of you will know now that a burglar can sue the occupant of a house either under the Occupiers Liability Act or at common law if, for example, they put barbed wire on the fence and they cut their hand. Now, it's difficult to fathom why all the political parties have perpetuated this situation, because surely repealing this law would be universally popular. When the Occupiers Liability Act was implemented, the Bill's spokesman, Lord Hailsham, said, "We need this act to protect," and he gave an example, "innocent young boys picking apples in an orchard who might get injured by some kind of severe negligence of the landowner." But obviously, the law can easily make a distinction between those innocent boys and somebody who breaks into a dwelling house and who's quite willing to injure the occupants if they get in his way. It's fairly obvious, and Lord Hailsham was actually a distinguished lawyer and judge. I think he was at least a High Court judge. He may have even been an appellate judge. So not only is his reasoning wrong, but I can't believe that he really thought that. I think there must have been some other reason. And I'm not suggesting that I know what it was, but there must have been some other motive why he enacted the Occupiers Liability Act. In education, the state seems to view its role as a moral teacher now, instead of thinking that it's for the family to pass on their morality to the children, and it's for the state to educate on objective matters such as mathematics, geography, natural sciences. The state is involved in things like citizenship classes, sex education and moral education, and on some issues children have been specifically encouraged to challenge their parents, namely on climate change and on sexuality. Last, I'm just giving a very specific example which didn't actually materialise into anything, whereby Gordon Brown thought it was up to him to deposit £500 in the bank account of every child irrespective of the means of the family. So clearly, in his view, it's not the role of the family to provide a nest egg for their children, it's the role of the state. And the effect, of course, of those kind of policies is to gradually erode people's dependence on the family and increase their dependence on the state. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. We'll take some questions now. Tried to keep it a bit shorter so we'd have more time for questions. So, does anybody have any questions?
Can I ask about, basically, you put forward the proposition that there's a well-worked out ideology on the left to undermine the family as an independent and economically independent unit, and to make people more and more dependent on the state. Now, if you're going to fracture the family and break the family and make people more and more dependent on the state, this is going to produce a huge bill for the state, isn't it? The state is going to have to get more and more resources to take up its responsibility. Do you think that's one of the reasons we're in the mess at the moment now, that the state has overreached itself and is like taking on too many burdens, and it can't finance them anymore?
Yes, I think that is true. I think they seem to think that they don't understand about limited government. They seem to think that their role has to continually increase. And actually the size of government has continued to increase at the expense of the family. Well, really, it's certainly in the modern political era anyway, certainly since the Second World War, even the First World War.
Isn't that ultimately self-defeating for the state, though? Because the state cannot finance, unless it imposes a greater and greater tax burden on population, which will lead to economic inefficiency, the state cannot take up these responsibilities. So in the end, you're left with chaos because the family has been undermined and the state can't take up the responsibility. So it's a failing system. Is that one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed?
I think so, yeah, without being an expert on that, and I defer to your experience on that. But yes, I think it is. I don't think they've considered the practicalities of it. They're motivated by ideology. They despise the family because it prevents them from indoctrinating people, and it stands in the way of people being absolutely loyal to the state.
I honestly think that what's happened over the last several decades has been deliberate by the Marxists. Right. Now, Labour will try and call themselves socialists, but within the Labour Party there are Marxists, and they have changed our culture deliberately by passing these laws. One of the main aims of the revolutionary socialists is to undermine the family, cause confusion, so that it enables them then to get the revolution that they want in the future. And so they've attacked the family in several levels. Obviously, there's been the welfare state. There should be a safety net, but it's become more than that. So that the money is so targeted as to split families, because once you're not reliant on each other as a family financially and in a loving way, and you've got an alternative, the state, or should I say, the taxpayer is providing you with the money, then it's a lot easier for you to leave that family unit.
Yeah.
That's just one example of it.
I think that's been there's some examples of people explicitly being, and I think particularly Hazel Blairs and Harman, I couldn't find the examples in time for the lecture, of them being specifically in favour of women leaving their husbands, and of single motherhood being a genuine choice available to women, not just an unfortunate predicament they find themselves in. They want it to be viewed as an alternative and possibly a replacement to the family.
John, can I ask you one question? Would MPs have the parliamentary privilege of not being prosecuted, but they come under the same law as us?
You mean...
Not if you broke into an MP's house.
Oh, I see. Parliamentary privilege applies to what's said in Parliament. So you can't be sued for defamation, you can't be prosecuted under, say, for contempt of court. So that the same law ostensibly applies to them. But I'm sure they can be more relaxed about it because they live in very big gated houses and they're not going to have people breaking into their house at 4 o'clock in the morning. So they can be sanctimonious about the rights of burglars.
The first thing is that the left, who have done most to encourage family breakdown, also purport to represent the interests of the most vulnerable in society, who family breakdowns seems to affect disproportionately. I mean, the chattering class, Islington, Guardianistas, family breakdown is something that they can kind of bear given their wealth and position. But family breakdown, if you go into estates in rundown parts of the country, has been an absolute catastrophe in these parts of the country, and they've actively encouraged it to as you've mentioned, certain aspects of welfare as well.
Melanie Phillips makes that exact point in the book, which I've cited quite a lot, actually. And particularly for single mothers, it's okay for somebody on a six-figure sum to be a single mother. They can afford nannies, etc. But no, the ordinary working-class women are actually have been devastated by that policy.
Just one more question. I'm a deciduous defender of traditional family life and marriage, and understand the importance of it in terms of sustaining and promoting social stability. But there's a conundrum for conservatism in respect of civil partnerships for gay and lesbian people, for example, because they can't have it both ways. They can't, on one hand, from a moral point of view, abhor the kind of rampant promiscuity and apparently, amoral pursuit of hedonism, and at the same time, rail against legal recognition of commitment. Do you understand? So
Yeah.
Do you think there's support for civil partnerships from a conservative perspective?
The Conservative Party itself supports it. I think...
small C conservatives, like
Yeah.
I would class myself in the present.
I don't think even if you were opposed to civil partnerships, there'd be much practical benefit in actually repealing the Act. I don't think you'd suddenly get more strength in the family by doing so. I think I'd go back to what I said at the very beginning of the lecture. There's a difference between liberty and an actual privilege. Now, I do not, and I'd abhor persecuting people for what they do in their private life. I think you can pretty much do whatever you like unless it causes direct harm to somebody else. But to actually recognise a relationship, it should be what type of relationship that's sociologically beneficial. You can always look at individual relationships and say, well, the subjective quality of that gay relationship is perhaps better and more loving than another one, but on a sociological level, the traditional family, it engenders a bond between men and women, which other relationships don't do, and it means children are being raised by their natural parents.
Transmission of social
Yeah.
as well.
But it doesn't mean in any way you persecute people because they don't want to live that kind of life. It's a matter for them. As long as they adhere to the law, they should be left alone.
That's one of the big ammunition, one of the big guns that the left uses in putting forward people like women, groups of people like women, groups of people like homosexuals and other groups, and making them into victims, as it were, when they weren't victims, but they create this climate to make everyone think that they're being persecuted and raise up in arms, when in actual fact it's purely their way of breaking up the family and attacking the family, and that's all behind the feminist movements, you know, and there were abuses in the past where women were concerned, but this was a revolutionary weapon to attack the family and to undermine men.
Yeah.
Men, you know, and you see it in divorce cases, how men get the offender's stick when it comes to the settlements as well, and the man is in a really bad situation.
I think that has the effect of encouraging more women to divorce because they can commit adultery and still keep the children and most of the assets. But as regarding what you said earlier in your question, I think they've noticed some injustices, the Marxists, and they've used it for their own agenda.
The hijack.
Yes.
I think we've got to move on from the...
Sorry. Yeah. I was just trying to raise a question for Joe. I mean, the problem is families do break up, and it isn't because of external factors usually. Families break up all the time. Now, you have to have the state there as a safety net underneath people to some extent. But I mean, this is the dilemma, isn't it? Because I mean, you can't have it as a career option, and what it is now is for a lot of people. I mean, a lot where I used to live, it's multiple children by multiple fathers, and if you looked at the actual benefit levels, I couldn't earn that amount of money, you know, as a single person to sustain that family, and that's where a lot of people say, "Whoa, what's going on here? You know, this is crazy." So, how would you suggest a solution to this? Because you've got to have some sort of support, haven't you?
I wish I could be more specific now, but what I would say is I'd want to draw a distinction, because I think there's a moral distinction between women who've chosen to be in that situation and women who've been abandoned through no fault of their own. If you go back to the turn of the last century, women would do all they could to avoid being a single mother. And they probably suffered from a very unfair stigma status, because it wasn't their fault if somebody walked out on them. But as I say, I think you can infer that now many women are choosing it as a lifestyle choice.
Do women get it both ways? Because I know that the family courts in divorce settlements, they treat the women in the Victorian sense, where the women get the children, the women get support, and the man doesn't get any of that. You know, I mean,
The woman's still the homemaker, and she's...
well, yeah, they're viewed in the
You know that they can be the home break.
yeah. So the feminist movement doesn't seem to reach into that sort of aspect. in the
No.
family
Because
courts.
it doesn't suit them. Yeah.
Well, the aim, I think, of the divorce is to make sure a woman continues to enjoy the standard of living that she's become accustomed to. It's not to, as I would argue, to restore parties to their premarital states, which it should be, because if you're going to repudiate the marriage, you say, well, I don't want anything. I want to go back to, as far as possible, how things were before the marriage. But that's not the aim. It is often unfair. But not always. There are some examples where, of course, the man's got a favourable settlement because he was earning less money. But in most cases, it's the woman.
Can I suggest to you that your argument is flawed because you're arguing from a liberal perspective where people should be given freedom of choice and we shouldn't be judgmental on these issues. Now, the choices people make are not made in a moral vacuum. Those choices are informed by what they think the state actually prefers or